200,000. That is the number of American veterans of the First World War whose military service records were either never properly created, administratively separated from the files they belonged in, or destroyed through a combination of bureaucratic decisions that unfolded across 3 decades following the armistice, in ways that the official history of American military record-keeping has consistently described as accidental. Not 200,000 records lost in a single dramatic event. Not 200,000 files consumed in one fire on one night at one facility. 200,000 individual human beings who served in the United States military between April of 1917 and November of 1918, who were wounded in France and Belgium, who were gassed on the Western Front and developed chronic conditions that would follow them for the rest of their lives, who came home to an America that had promised them recognition, medical care, and financial support for the service they had performed, and who found, when they tried to access what they had been promised, that the documentation establishing their entitlement to those promises either could not be located or did not exist in the form required to support a successful claim. I found this while researching the destruction of the 1890 census, following the pattern of government records that seemed to disappear at precisely the moments when their contents would have been most consequential to the people whose lives they documented. The First World War record problem belongs to a later period than the census, but it follows the same structural logic with a consistency that stopped me when I first recognized it. Records that would have established legal entitlement to benefits, a system overwhelmed by volume that processed those records without adequate organization, redundancy, or quality control. Administrative decisions made in the years following the initial crisis that progressively reduced the resources available for reconstruction while simultaneously tightening the evidentiary requirements that the affected population had to meet. And a final destruction event, decades after the initial problem, that is so dramatic and so well documented that it tends to absorb all the historical attention, leaving the slower and less visible process that preceded it essentially unexamined. The official story of American military record-keeping during the First World War begins with an acknowledgement that is entirely accurate. The United States entered the war in April of 1917 with a military establishment whose administrative infrastructure had been designed for a peacetime army of fewer than 200,000 soldiers. Within 18 months, that infrastructure was responsible for processing the records of 4 million men. The scaling problem was genuine. Filing systems that worked adequately for 200,000 records could not handle 4 million records without breaking down. Clerks who were trained to process documentation at a pace appropriate to a peacetime army could not maintain consistent quality while simultaneously working at wartime speed. Records were created inconsistently. Documents were misfiled in ways that would not be discovered until years later when someone tried to retrieve them. Some records were simply never created because the clerks responsible for creating them were overwhelmed. All of this is true. All of this is the official explanation for why so many First World War veterans' records were inadequate when those veterans began filing benefit claims in the early 1920s. What the official explanation does not address is what happened in the years after the war, after the volume pressure had been relieved, after the administrative infrastructure had returned to something approaching its normal operating capacity, after the specific problem of inadequate documentation for specific veterans had been identified and documented in congressional hearings and in the Veterans Bureau's own annual reports. What happened in those years was not a systematic reconstruction of the inadequate records. What happened was a progressive tightening of the evidentiary requirements that veterans had to meet while simultaneously reducing the administrative resources available for the kind of records reconstruction that would have allowed more veterans to meet those requirements. The Veterans Bureau, established in 1921 to consolidate the various agencies handling veteran benefits, was fully aware from its earliest years of operation that documentation gaps were affecting claims outcomes. Congressional hearings in 1923 produced testimony documenting specific cases, veterans who had unquestionably served, who had been wounded in documented engagements, whose service was known to their surviving comrades, but whose official documentation was insufficient to support the benefit claims they were filing. The Bureau's response to this documented problem was not to develop a systematic program for reconstructing the missing documentation. Its response was to deny the claims that could not be supported by the documentation that existed, and to make the denial process progressively more efficient over the course of the 1920s. Now, here is where it gets strange. The veterans most likely to have inadequate documentation were not randomly distributed across the population of 4 million men who had served. They followed demographic lines with a consistency that becomes visible when you examine the benefits claims record systematically rather than case by case. Working-class veterans. Veterans who had served in units with less administrative support. Veterans whose psychological injuries made it difficult for them to navigate bureaucratic claims processes without assistance. Veterans who could not afford legal representation and were therefore limited to the documentation they could assemble on their own. And, most consequentially, black veterans who had served in the segregated units of the 92nd and 93rd Divisions. The segregated units of the American Expeditionary Forces were administered through a parallel structure within the military's record-keeping system, a structure that was less well-resourced than the corresponding structure for white units. That maintained records to a less consistent standard. That had less institutional capacity for the kind of careful documentation that benefit claims would eventually require. When black veterans of the 92nd and 93rd Divisions began filing disability claims in the early 1920s, they encountered documentation gaps at rates substantially higher than white veterans filing comparable claims. Researchers who examined Veterans Bureau claims records decades after the fact found clear evidence of this differential. It was not acknowledged by the Bureau at the time. It was not addressed by any corrective program. It was simply reflected year after year in the higher rates at which black veterans' claims were denied. The chemical weapons used extensively on the Western Front created their own specific documentation crisis. Mustard gas, chlorine, and phosgene were deployed against American troops throughout the American Expeditionary Forces period of engagement. Soldiers who survived gas attacks frequently developed chronic conditions that manifested years or decades after the original exposure. Respiratory disease, skin disorders, eye damage that progressed slowly through the post-war years. Establishing a service connection for these conditions required documentation of the original gas exposure, documentation that existed in the records of field hospitals and medical units that had treated soldiers during the war, records that had been maintained under battlefield conditions, records that had been transferred to Washington in the immediate post-war period through a process that was, by the War Department's own subsequent acknowledgement, poorly documented and poorly controlled. Records that arrived in Washington separated from the personnel files they needed to be matched to. Records that did not arrive in Washington but were listed as transferred. Records where the gap between what the transfer documentation claimed had been sent and what the receiving office could confirm had been received was never systematically reconciled. Veterans who had been gassed on the Western Front and who were developing serious health conditions a decade later found that the documentation of their exposure existed, in theory, somewhere in the military's records, but that nobody had built the system to locate it and connect it to their personnel file, and that in the absence of that connection, their claims were being evaluated as though the exposure had never been documented. The 1973 fire at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis is the event that most Americans who know anything about First World War records losses associate with the problem. The fire was real. It was devastating. It consumed approximately 16 to 18 million military personnel files, including records from the Army and Air Force covering specific periods. For First World War veterans, the fire destroyed records that had survived 50 years of administrative handling since the armistice. The fire matters. Its effects on the availability of First World War records are real and significant, but the fire has absorbed so much historical attention that it functions as a kind of explanation for a problem that substantially predates it. The veterans who could not establish their benefit claims in the 1920s did not fail because their records burned in 1973. They failed because their records were inadequate in 1921, and because the system responsible for managing those records chose to deny claims rather than reconstruct documentation. The veterans who died in poverty during the Depression, unable to access disability compensation that their service had earned, did not die because of a fire that was still 40 years in the future. They died because the administrative decisions made in the decade immediately following their return home had established a system in which inadequate documentation meant denied claims and denied claims meant no support. The 1973 fire completed a process of loss that had begun with the first inadequate intake form processed under wartime pressure in 1917. It is the most visible and most dramatic moment in a sequence of loss that the official history treats as beginning there. It did not begin there. Here is what 200,000 actually represents. It is the number derived by researchers who cross-referenced draft registration records, unit rosters, casualty lists, and surviving personnel files against the gaps in the benefits claims record. It is the minimum estimate for the number of veterans whose documentation was sufficiently inadequate to affect their ability to establish benefit eligibility. It is not a precise figure. It cannot be a precise figure because the gaps in the record are by definition the places where precision is impossible. The actual number of veterans whose lives were materially affected by those documentation gaps, whose medical care was delayed or denied, whose disability compensation was reduced or eliminated, whose families went without support they had been promised, is larger than 200,000. How much larger cannot be determined, because determining it would require the documentation that is missing. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. The last living American veteran of the First World War died in 2011. 93 years elapsed between those two dates. During all 93 of those years, the government that had sent those men to France maintained custody of the records that determined what it owed them. During those 93 years, administrative decisions were made that allowed the gaps in those records to persist, that denied claims based on those gaps, that moved inadequate records from one storage facility to another without ever resolving the inadequacy, and that ultimately failed to protect a significant portion of those records from the fire that destroyed them in 1973. The men who served are gone. The records that documented what they were owed are gone in large part. The gap between what was promised and what was delivered has been attributed to wartime administrative chaos, post-war bureaucratic growing pains, and the tragic accident of the 1973 fire. None of those explanations restore what was lost. None of them return the benefits that were denied because documentation that should have existed did not. None of them address the question that the pattern of loss demands. Why did the documentation gaps that produced the most denials fall most heavily on the veterans least equipped to challenge those denials? Why did the documentation for black veterans in segregated units prove inadequate at higher rates than documentation for white veterans in equivalent circumstances? Why did the administrative decisions made in the 1920s respond to the documented problem of inadequate records by tightening evidentiary requirements rather than by funding documentation reconstruction? Why did the records that burned in 1973 include so disproportionately large a share of records that had already been identified as incomplete or problematic? These questions have answers. The answers are in the administrative records of the Veterans Bureau and the War Department from the 1920s. Records that document the decisions that were made and the reasoning that was offered for making them. Those records have not been systematically examined against the claims outcomes they produced, because examining them that way would require asking whether the administrative decisions of the 1920s were driven by the stated goal of providing benefits to deserving veterans or by the unstated goal of minimizing the number of claims that would have to be paid. That question has never been asked by any official body with the authority and the resources to answer it. The men who came home from France deserve to have it asked. 200,000 of them came home with no records. The records existed. The system lost them. And the official history of that loss has spent 100 years looking at the fire instead of the decisions that came before it. If you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.